The Powers Project.
Jason, how you doing today, sir?
Great, Kurt. You?
I'm doing great. I see you're out there, and I'm in Florida. You're in California, both sunny places right now. So
Yeah, we got beautiful weather out here.
yeah, I wish. I mean, honestly, our weather's been kind of beautiful. It's not been as hot as it normally is this time of year, so it's we've had a little reprieve because usually we don't start getting cooler weather until sometime next month. So it's been nice, but it's good to see.
Yeah, we have an oil spill though down near Orange County, which kind of sucks. I surf a bit in Laguna Beach and I think it's Huntington are just getting about to get slammed, which sucks, but
Yeah, I
should go
saw
away.
that. Yeah. Do you still have the fires going on out there, or what?
Yeah, you know what's weird is that October's been a really bad month for fires the last couple of years because it stays hot here. I think the wind's been picking up and it's just it gets dry after so many hot months that some of
Yeah.
the worst fires are happening. I don't know right now. I think they're not crazy, but some will probably start up in a
Yeah.
couple weeks. So.
Well, good luck with all that. Seriously, I love California, and if it wasn't so expensive, I'd probably live there. So,
Right.
but anyway, I have you on the show today because you're an expert on all things China, and with the things that have been going on recently in the news and how it affects us here in the U.S. I wanted to have you on because there's so much misinformation out there that that we've been told, and I like to get to the truth. I like this. I like to find out what is really going on besides what's being fed to us through, I hate saying this, but mainstream media, because we know that they're not always honest and about things, and they have their own agenda as to why they push things a certain way. So I thought, if I could ask you, maybe the first question would be like, what are your thoughts on the current relationship between China and the U.S. right now?
Yeah, I think, well, there's the first thing is I think we were talking about the misinformation. I think you really nailed it. There's all sorts of information about China flying around, and it's coming from various sources that have their own interests. Historically, in the corporate side, since the 90s, there's been the interest in cheap labor, maintaining friendly relations, keeping inflation low, keeping products, shipping them out of China in mass quantities. On the government side, the U.S. government for a long time, 90s and 2000s, there's been this need to feeling you need to integrate China. You don't want competition. You don't want conflict, and a sort of vague hope that things would start turning out more like Western Europe over there. And a lot of these main channels of information that we've had, kind of from the financial world, from the business world, from the public sector, they're all kind of crumbling right now with everything that's going on in China. So that's kind of what's going on. So to answer your question about the relationship, it's getting real bad. That's just the simple way to say it. There's some good things happening, like the lady, I think it was, the CFO of Huawei, which is a big company that the Trump administration was kind of slapping down a couple of years ago. They released her out of Canada, and people are kind of saying, oh, things are getting better. But the truth is, things are getting bad on every single front possible. And there's the same U.S. public, state goal of not getting things too heated with China is coming back. Is kind of what happens more under Democratic presidents. They think, oh, the heat is too strong. Let's pull back a couple ways. Let's release this person. Let's calm things down because things can get pretty heated. So we learned that there was a bit of there was calls that were made to the Chinese military towards the end of the Trump administration just to ensure everybody knew that military conflict wasn't inevitable. Right? We're in one of those places where the potential for misinterpretations of behavior, of wording and stuff is actually very, very strong. And the propaganda machine in China for internal propaganda and external propaganda is very fragile and it's running on overdrive. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, but the core of it is just that things are kind of degenerating across the board. And there's a broad sort of decoupling happening between the US technological, financial, economic, and political worlds and the Chinese one. And that's what we're seeing. And it's the the Biden administration wanted to make it seem like there was more of a big break between Democratic Biden policy and Republican Trump policy. There really isn't. They're about to dust off the same laws that Trump used for tariffs on China to do other things, to hit them for industrial subsidies, hit them for this, to hit them for that. There's just, the truth is the American public is fed up with China, is hostile towards China, is vaguely belligerent towards China. So both political parties are responding. And the Democrats historically were a bit more even keeled on the China thing. Just leave it alone. Don't have chaos there. Don't have a war. But after 2016, Trump galvanized a huge part of the American electorate and rode into office in part with this animus against China. So Democrats aren't willing to let the other side have all the cards on them. So it's gonna be very hard to sort of de-escalate in this sort of situation. It's sort of just gonna keep heading aground. That's where the relationship is going.
Would you say that it's put the Democrats in? All right, so let me ask you something, because when Trump came into office and he placed these tariffs on China, and it slowed down China's economic growth, which of course is going to cause tensions between the countries. But do you think that was necessary? Do you think that Trump did the right thing? Because I'm not a Trump fan by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm willing to give credit where credit's due. Was it the right thing to put these tariffs on there to make it more fair?
I don't think the tariffs made things more fair. The truth is, tariffs are they were really like, this isn't the 1980s anymore, I guess is the way to put it. What happens in China with manufacturing is something like 80% of the products shipped out of China are really just assembled in China. So little components are taken from all over the world, wherever they're cheapest to produce, and they're shipped to China to be assembled together into one product. So the challenge with tariffs is that it just tends to move production other places. And basically the global supply chains are very intricate and complicated. And to really get the effect that I guess Trump was after requires a bit more, requires sort of a global effort. And well, just to your point, I think that the truth about China is that its growth rate was plummeting years ago. And what happened in China is that they overinvested, right? China was a poor agricultural country. You had to build all sorts of stuff to bring it up to par. But then what they did is they kept building. Once it was up to par, once they had all the roads, the infrastructure and everything, they kept building to keep the growth numbers high. So, that's like, if this was a financial company, that'd be fraud, right? Like that'd be some version of like, hey, the number, you just keep putting up these numbers, but nobody needs this. Like you're digging holes and, why are you digging a hole here? We're not putting anything in it. That's sort of what's going on. That's sort of the deeper thing about the Chinese economy. I think the tariff question was a political question in the US. What's interesting about it is that the Democrats were on board with punishing China. They just thought Trump's method was stupid. Like, oh, tariffs don't work. Tariffs don't work. Well, tariffs work in certain ways, but it's a real challenge. I mean, so the truth is that the steel and sort of the main metal processing, metal refining and stuff in the United States, there's a whole transformation going on using mini mills and using electric mills and sort of transforming some of the basic industrial processes to use scrap materials. And there's a whole transformation of the U.S. industrial supply chain really going on within the country for various reasons, for cheap natural gas, cheap oil that we're having now due to fracking. So that's all going on. And a lot of that's kind of independent of the China stuff. But a lot of it was really pushed by some of the larger and less competitive U.S. steel and aluminum companies. But what's happening is we're going to see a big shakeup in that regardless. I think that some of the position, it was probably a local benefit in certain ways. It was good. I mean, the truth about the tariffs is, how would I say it? I wouldn't look at it and say, this was a slam dunk. Like tariffs fixed something in the industry, tariffs fix this, fix that. The bigger implication of it was really just how it started to reframe everything about what the U.S. could do, what sort of tools national tools the U.S. could use against other countries, especially other major countries. The U.S. hadn't slapped massive tariffs, massive punitive measures against a country like that in a very long time, like a major country. We're talking like Japan, the Soviet Union, stuff like that, particularly in the 80s. So that was a big change. And the way things are going with the sort of crumbling of supply chains, we have 80 ships backed up in the port of LA, 80 ships that are just floating out in the water. This is the largest port complex for the West Coast, for the country. And it's where a lot of the Chinese goods and Asian goods come in. And you have such a systemic problem throughout the logistics chain to even ship things in, ship things out. Costs are rising, shipping rates are rising, transit times are rising. We're seeing another reconfiguring of this global supply chain. It's the same way that the industrial supply chain in the U.S. is changing. So there's just so many moving pieces right now that specific tariffs on specific things, that ain't going to be it. What we're going to see, if the government was sort of really intent on this, they would be doing things to induce companies to move as much production back to the U.S. And that's sort of slowly where the tariff operation moved us, right? This is basically economic nationalism. This is moving production to the US. And companies are actually on board with this because you want to produce where you consume. So Tesla's a really good example. Tesla's now one of the largest industrial companies in the US, just market cap wise. And what they did is they built a factory in the US for US cars. They're building a factory in Europe for cars they want to sell in Europe. They have a factory in China for cars they want to sell in China. And it's this thing of, building where you sell. And the thing about the US is it has the largest consumer market. So a lot of companies already want to sell in the US, and the US government and companies, if they wanted, can use the strength and the size and the depth of the US consumer market to basically force or induce companies to come back here. And some are already doing that anyway. You add in the US dollar, you add in some other factors, and there's a lot of things pulling companies in. And yeah, and you add sort of global chaos going on all around the world. And the US, even for all of our problems, we look like a relative beacon of stability. And you'll see that in the US dollar and other places.
So basically, are you saying that these tariffs were used to create this national economic situation where these companies that are US companies would come back here and have things built back in this country to drive jobs back here?
No, so I think most of that was already happening. It was kind of under the hood. Those things were moving in that direction. What the tariffs did is it showed the U.S. government was behind this effort, like it would start pushing this. So the Biden administration just put out a $100 billion bill that is doing pure like industrial policy. So it's like we're going to build semiconductors in Arizona and Texas, right? They're getting they're supporting tens of billions of investment there from Taiwanese, Korean, and other companies. So we're already in this area of bring it back here. And I think it wasn't just the tariffs. The tariffs were more a show that the U.S. government could start doing stuff like this. Because originally, during the last 75 years, the U.S. government wanted a hands-off posture. It wanted the rest of the world to think, oh, we're all in this together. We're all, trying to build ourselves up and fight the Soviets and, bring peace and everything all around the world. Now it's a bit more different. I mean, it's a bit more, we're a bit more self-centered in what's going on. After losing wars in the Middle East, feeling the rise of China, kind of seeing the chaos that's going around, the U.S. just, I think the U.S. public is kind of fed up with doing stupid things abroad and failing. I think the U.S. The government knows they're probably just going to look stupid and fail, so they're kind of sticking around to some of the stuff closer to home.
I don't even know if they even care. I think I think it's gotten to the point where even once people figure out what's going on, I mean, we have politicians who they just don't care. I'm not going to go into naming, but they're on both sides. It's not like it's just one side. They're on both sides of the fence, and they don't care. They don't mind looking like hypocrites. And for instance, we know that that's this 20-year war over in Afghanistan. Not to get off base here, but it was just to make profit for the military industrial complex, and that's what they did. That's because they banked on this. And what did we accomplish?
I'd push back on that just because the military industrial complex really thrives actually through weapons development. So It thrives when you're competing with something like the Soviet Union, and then you have to build huge systems. So in the 90s, we had huge cuts across the defense sector, and it required all sorts of mergers. So Boeing bought this company, Lockheed bought this company, and they all kind of merged. There's only a few left. And what happened when you start 2001, it actually pulled the whole defense industry away from major systems development, major money makers. And it's actually now that we're out of Afghanistan, that the U.S. government and the whole industrial defense supply chain is pushing development against China like crazy. We're seeing more investment in all sorts of crazy systems than we saw before when we were in Afghanistan. So I think the Afghanistan and Iraq thing was just a failure. This is one of the areas where the U.S. government wasn't really saying what they were doing. The U.S. public knew it was nonsense, and it just went on for so long that we don't even talk about the whole thing anymore. Right. So it's one of these things that there's no accountability for politicians. You get us into a war, you're not even around 2 years later, let alone 10. Right. So no one gets punished, and the truth doesn't really come out; it just kind of sinks below the surface. And unfortunately, we're caught in a little bit of a, we still think Iraq was mainly about oil, but whose oil? The U.S. ended up becoming pretty oil independent by, towards 2010, or like it was on the track towards that with what was going on in Texas. And so it's really more about, some other things. And we don't have to get all into that, but I think that the big thing about, sort of this, just the defense question, I think that it's always good to keep in mind, like in the 50s and 60s, in 50s in particular, it's like the military industrial complex was a real thing. That was big. It was huge. Eisenhower was a former general. We would just come out of World War II. We'd fought a global war in 2 theaters, and like in Europe and Asia, it was huge. There was in massive administrative capacity in the government to get all sorts of things done. The Manhattan Project, logistics, all this stuff they were doing in the military, in the space, and all that. That was a different era. The military industrial complex is much weaker these days. It's overstated what it really is. It's a small, it's like 10, 15 companies. They're pretty big, but they're becoming sort of diversified industrial conglomerates. And a lot of them are behind the ball on a lot of basic consumer electronics. You see, I'm getting a little aside here, but like the rapid improvement you see in something like, let's say iPhones before they just started doing camera improvements. Like, you saw all that, the huge growth that you don't see, or, Apple computers now, they have semiconductors specifically designed for Apple software. And it's, they're getting huge improvements in speed and, the lower heat usage, lower energy, longer battery, all this stuff is coming out now because there's this very tight, rapidly iterating sort of technology that they're developing. It's never been like that in the military. It's been a long time since it's been like that. They have these very long procurement cycles. There's all these requirements, there's all this back and forth. So it actually moves very slowly. And in China, they have something called civil military fusion. So basically what they're trying to do there is they're thinking, okay, we need to juice up our military. We've got problems everywhere. We have to, we want to conquer Taiwan. We have to deal with Hong Kong. We have the Uyghurs. We have possible skirmishes in the Himalayas. We have a million problems. We have the South China Sea. We have the US Navy everywhere and up in our grill. There's a lot of problems for China. And they want to bring the equivalent of those innovations you see in a company like Apple, or in China would be like Huawei or the drone maker DJI. It wants to bring those skills, all those useful technologies, all those development processes into the military. So the idea is civil military fusion. You take the really advanced, innovative elements of modern commercial enterprise, and you bring it to the military. So that's what's going on in China, because it's also a signal that a lot of the military operations, institutions, everything in China is actually very decrepit, right? It's very corrupt. It's very decrepit as part of the party. It's sick, sick in a lot of ways. And it's not that bad in the US. These are, relatively innovative companies, but I'm bringing this up just to show that like the real money, the real power, the real labor talent is actually not in the major defense contractors the way it was. To be fair, I think that if you let the US military go where it's going the next 15 years, it does all the development it's planning to do, it's going to be a very, very mean military to deal with. All right. I mean, so this is sort of the question of like Vietnam. The US left Vietnam in a really ignominious way, kind of like we saw in Afghanistan. It was like a terrible defeat. There was the whole Saigon. There was the image of the helicopters and all that, kind of similar to what happened here. And then, a little while later, in the early 90s, you get Operation Desert Storm, which was absolute ridiculous, one-sided, lopsided victory. It actually sent shivers of terror in Beijing because it showed them that their whole military structure was totally deficient and would be annihilated in a real conflict. So it provoked massive transformation of the Chinese military throughout the 90s. And that's, this stuff is usually important. The military stuff is usually important to keep in mind just because there's always the potential for conflict with China and the United States. But the idea that the military industrial complex at this point can really push the major government actors to do wars and stuff, I think it was, it's definitely not that way now. I think even in the mid 2000s, sort of oil interest energy is a very important thing right now. There's a major energy crisis in China. We obviously saw the problems in Texas when that big freeze happened earlier this year. Energy is a very important thing. Europe's is currently going through massive energy shortages. It's going to hit them this winter. The Russians are purposely keeping off the pipes to prevent natural gas from flowing to Europe, trying to put the squeeze even harder on the Europeans. We're entering a world where this stuff is really going to matter. And a lot of the conservative establishment in the mid 2000s that were, the old bellicose sort of neocons, they were wrong about a lot of things, but the importance of energy in the modern world, they're right about, so you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, even though it was a stupid war and there was all this stupid stuff. The centrality of energy is something we're definitely going to need to keep in mind this decade. And, we're seeing that with what's going on in China right now.
So we see
crazy.
more throughout the world. We're seeing more nationalist economies rather than this global economy that we become used to being told that's what we need to be part of, is this global economy that now is prevalent throughout the world. And now you're saying that we're having a pullback and it's becoming more nationalist, right?
Yeah. So, starting in the 80s, we really were able to put this world economy together, right? You had all the big cargo ships, you had the information technology to communicate all the different pieces. You could start doing what I was talking about earlier, where you build everything, you build this in build a little widget in the Philippines, you build this in Sri Lanka, and you build this. And you couldn't even coordinate that kind of thing before. So it made it possible. And then you had the US Navy patrolling the whole world. There's no piracy. There's no one duking it out on the high seas. Everything can move everywhere. There's no the sea's where you want to go. 95% of global trade happens at sea because it's cheap. You can do huge amounts of it. You have buoyancy. Everything floats. It's really good. But yeah, we are that the era of globalization is ended. It should be clear to anybody looking at the news. Like, again, we're not provided this information. So for us, we're just trying to interpret it in kind of the world we know. But what we're seeing is the end. It's the end of the era of globalization, and it's going to impact the world in different ways. So I think what I was saying with the United States is, yes, it will end up being more nationalist here. It will probably coordinate with some neighboring nations, and then some like-minded sort of Anglo nations. So we recently saw a military deal between the U.S., the U.K., and Australia. It kicked out the French, and it was basically a submarine military technology transfer deal meant to coordinate these countries against China. And this Anglo world, and then sort of some of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, that's the US's natural group of countries, right? That's actually, I mean, so a bigger question, a broader question is like, well, do we even have the right language to talk about politics anymore? What does it mean that the US has an alliance with anyone? What does it mean? What does an alliance mean? What does an alliance with Germany mean? What it means, we have troops stationed there, that we occupied this country after a war. Like, it's actually very weird when you get down to it, right? There's some very funky things. So we're probably not thinking about all this correctly. It's just, again, we're only fed the frames that we're sort of media kind of does to make things simple, and doesn't really analyze all this. But the thing that's going on is this end of globalization. And so many areas are responding in different ways. The US is becoming more nationalist, trying to keep the rest of things together. But a lot of countries don't have the option of being national. They don't have what they need within their own country. That's the challenge. So the great benefit of globalization. So sometimes I refer to like 1945 to 2020 as the development era. This was the era where you could develop. If you were a poor, formerly, famine-stricken, war-torn country, and suddenly, there's peace in your country, you had access to global resources, you had access to fertilizers and, fuel from around the world, and semiconductors and computers and clothing and everything. You could start to develop a country and a society that you never had, really. And that's why you saw the big greatest gains of human welfare ever, just in the last 75 years. But keeping all this together isn't cheap, it's not easy, and it wasn't natural. So this was a tough thing to do, and it's no longer, for various reasons, that the pieces don't come together, and we're seeing this deglobalization happen. But a lot of these places that were famine stricken, war torn, or whatever, they don't pull themselves together. I mean, this is the sort of the sad element to it. You look at Europe, which we think is typically a bunch of advanced countries and modern and developed and social welfare states and all that. Well, before the US was in there with its military, they were just fighting each other forever, all the time. Endless wars. Germany and France have fought like 20 wars or something. They have little countries like the reason countries like Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg, they exist to build a borderland between Germany and France because they just fought each other so much. And so I'm not suggesting that they're going to fight each other, but these old questions about real politics, about war, about nationhood, about class, and everything. Unfortunately, they come back to the fore when you don't have this era of pleasant, easy development. And the truth is that most countries never developed for basic material reasons. They didn't have what they needed, and they needed a system that provided it to them. When that system goes away, they can't have what they used to have.
Okay, I have so many questions right now. So, isn't it though? I mean, didn't Europe figure out? Okay, look, it's better that we don't fight amongst each other, especially when we have the Soviet Union right there, and the reason why the U.S. obviously is in Germany. as it is in Taiwan or Guam or throughout the world, is to ensure that we have a foothold in there to make sure that China doesn't take over or Russia doesn't take over. That we're there to say we, like we're supposedly, backing Taiwan. Now, I find that interesting, and I don't want to go off on that yet because I do want to talk about that. But I mean, we strategically position ourselves throughout the world so that we make sure that Russia doesn't advance any further than where it's at, or China doesn't advance any further than where it's at, and so it's in our own best interest to make sure that we maintain these positions. At least that's my understanding. Okay. The other thing is, I lost my train of thought because you said something. I was like, oh man, I got to ask you about that.
Here, I could just answer the first one if you
Yeah,
want.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that, and I think that's basically right. What the U.S. does, and what kind of a country like the U.S. does, is it looks around the world, looks at the global map, it sees the potential competitors and strong countries, and tries to create a balance of power in those regions. Doesn't want any country to become too powerful. So you look at the Middle East, you see, like for right now, you'll see, or just historically, you basically see Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. All these four countries there's key global resources there, and the U.S. basically wants to go around, either put its finger on the button, thumb on the scale for one country to keep it, make sure it's a little powerful, make sure the one country doesn't take over all the other ones. So basically, Europe's the best example. Germany wanted to take over Europe twice in World War II, in the 20th century, and the U.S. came in at the last minute and said no, can't do that. And then afterwards, and after the second round, it looked like the Russians, the Soviets, were going to do the exact same thing. So the U.S. stayed and said, no, you're not going to do that. And this world's development era after 1945 was specifically built to contain Soviet Union, right? We've heard the containment policy and all that. That's what it was for. The China stuff is actually kind of separate. The actual architecture of everything was for the Soviet Union. So that's where NATO, and back when NATO kind of meant something and really meant something, that's what it was for. But just to show that the world's very different now, Russia is not the Soviet Union. I mean, Russia has a smaller economy than Texas. It probably produces less oil and natural gas than Texas at this point. So we're talking about a country that's just on the U.S. is in a completely different stratosphere than Russia. It's not really a fair fight. I mean, I think that the problem with the U.S. is that it did too well, right? Didn't have beat the Soviet Union. So the real competitor now is China. And so I never really gave an intro, in the beginning, but one of the main reasons I got into China going on 15 years ago is that this is the last major competitor to the United States on the global map. You look at it, basically you can say, this is like the Risk chessboard, and the Risk that game Risk, where you kind of take over the world.
Right.
This is like that game. You see, here's all the places you can start. Who's left? Who do I have to go toe to toe with? And there's really not many people on the map anymore. Not many countries on the map that can challenge the United States. The last one is China. I could go into why India and Brazil and all these things are just basically financial marketing to sell you securities. That's what all this stuff, the hype was about, like these other emerging countries. But China's a real thing. So that's part of the reason I did this enormous deep dive into this whole project on the country, to kind of explain what's going on, why it relates to the United States, and sort of what we can learn from everything there to help our own country. So that's kind of where I came from. And the thing that happens is once the board is, so what we're seeing now is basically the U.S. is pivoting towards China. You can see it all of, you saw with the deal I just mentioned, where the U.S., the U.K., and Australia are sort of coordinating now against China, and they already do. And obviously there's Taiwan, there's Japan, there's South Korea, there's all this stuff. So the truth is China doesn't have the best hand. I mean, it has to kind of pummel its way through multiple countries to get anything done. That implies destroying its relationships with the rest of the world, destroying its access to key resources. Like I was mentioning earlier, China is one of those countries that doesn't have the resources within China to be what it is today. So China has always been a major country, but this is in the agricultural era. We basically had 99% of the country was poor farmers in the fields, plowing very small plots of land. It's a very different thing from a modern, mass, urban, industrial, advanced, like digital society. So it's a very different thing. And all the resources you need for what it has now, it doesn't have in the country. So it actually needs to maintain access to the rest of the world. So just for anyone listening, and that's always one of the reasons why there's always, China's always hesitant to do anything that seems totally crazy. Totally out there, because it'd have to be a big move. You know, you'd have to really kind of go for broke, right? This is sort of the, to use a 20th century analogy, would be, you know, Nazi Germany would be, not to equate Chinese with the Nazis, not that anybody cares, but the basically, you know, you have to power through, you have to do the quick, you know, blitzkrieg secret attack, you know, on these different regions, kind of get it out, get it done really quick, get into France, get into Poland, all that. The problem these days is, you know, information moves too fast, military still move relatively slow, and whole countries. I mean, the problem, China is like, Taiwan is a massive, indestructible aircraft carrier filled with 30 million people right off your coast. There's never been an invasion of an island, like of an advanced nation like that, island nation like that. It's, you know, the likelihood of that going very well for China is very low. They could, you know, they could easily lose something like a third of their military just trying to do that if things go poorly.
I want to ask you. So let's touch on that. But
We can double back anytime.
the question, yeah, I want to go back onto the military-industrial complex in a moment. But since we're on Taiwan, let's talk about that. So, what is China's deal with trying to push this? You know, like force to say, hey, this is our airspace. We're going to fly over it whenever we want. Upset the people of Taiwan because, you know, the president of Taiwan, she knows she has the backing of the U.S. China knows that the U.S. is committed to backing Taiwan. And yet, you know, I don't, because of China's money, because of China's market value, because they've gotten people to back down. I mean, the World Health Organization doesn't recognize Taiwan or won't recognize Taiwan because of China. You know, the NBA backed down, the NFL backed down. I mean, the World Wrestling Federation backed down because of, you know, because of money. And so it seems like that's the only real thing they have, because there's a prevailing thought out there that, you know, China's military power will lag seriously behind the U.S., you know, preventing it from becoming a world power. It's not going to be able to keep up with the U.S., which that's when I'll get back to the military industrial complex. But that's one of the main reasons why it'll never be the superpower. It won't be the preeminent power, you know, if you will, because its military will never be what the U.S. has.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why China probably won't be even a
Yeah,
totally functional country,
right.
right? But the military is a big one. They're and a good way to think about it is the. Well, yeah, I'll start with this and I'll touch back on Taiwan briefly at the end. I think that the U.S. and China are just very different countries. So the U.S. is out here in, you know, in North America, in the Western Hemisphere, and has two neighbors. It has Canada and it has Mexico. The U.S. military is not designed for Canada and Mexico, right? The full force of the U.S. military, you don't even need like for Canada, you don't even need the military for Canada. You probably do it with the police, okay? And then, you know, so the U.S. military is designed for something very different. It's designed for expeditionary war all across the world, right? There's various reasons for that, but that's a major thing. China is very different. China has more neighbors than any other country. Half of these other countries claim some part of Chinese land, and it has long, century long, even millennia long conflicts with the various peoples and nations around it. And the Chinese military the Chinese defense sector, whatever you want to call it, is designed for two things. So it's designed to it's designed to deal with all the immediate threats all around it. The US has no threats. China has a bunch of threats. So the Chinese military is stationed all over the country, stationed in the Himalayas, in Western deserts, Northern deserts, stationed along the coast, in the mountainous south, the jungly sort of southwest. And principally, actually, the entire Chinese military is designed to conquer Taiwan. That's been the primary operating thing since the late 70s. And the other thing that it's meant to do, so this comes from the immediate threats, right? This is sort of like, where is a country in the world? That tells you a lot about kind of why its military might be shaped a certain way, why many parts of the country are the way they are. The US, massive country, massive economy, basically a giant island, and it just sends out its ships and tanks and stuff all over the world for various reasons. China's very different. China's like a giant bunkered fortress surrounded by enemies, and it has its people stationed all along the walls. And it had a great wall for kind of that reason. The other thing China is focusing on is controlling its own population. So we assume that China is often just like the United States, where it's a bunch of Chinese people in China, It's like Americans in America. And yeah, we had a civil war. Yeah, everyone's really polarized, but we're all the same people. It's not really like that in China. China spends more on its internal security than on external defense, right? That's always a big, hard one for people to understand. The U.S. spends almost nothing on its internal security, right? All the police, that's local government, that's nothing. I mean, the Chinese, state, provincial, and federal, and equivalent of federal government, central government, spend more on all that than it does on all the ships and tanks and everything it wants to do to go toe to toe with the United States, to conquer Taiwan, all that. So it has huge costs that it's paying every day. And so just an example, the pandemic, the whole massive lockdown it had back in, what was it, February and March of 2020, that wasn't really a public health operation. I mean, that was the mobilization of internal security resources China had developed to prevent basically rebellions and insurrections, and it was applied to a public health crisis. But what we actually saw was the first time that whole system came online, and it's very, very horrifying, striking, vaguely impressive thing. Just that it's always awe-inspiring what China will do to sort of manage its own population. But these costs are, and these structures are very different. So we're talking about the military in China sort of being able to compete globally with the United States. They're just structured for very different things. And if you look at innovation in China, so let's say, I was talking about innovation in the military sector, and the US does all sorts of things and whatever. In China, a lot of resources are going towards surveillance. There's something like 450 million cameras in China, right? It's almost double the US population. It's just in cameras, because they want to track everyone. There's enormous investment going into surveillance companies and various AI companies, machine learning companies, data mining companies, all these people, biometrics, all this stuff that is used to identify, control, observe, induce different behaviors in the population. This is where a lot of investment is going. A lot of this was used to control originally the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. And what all this is for, and what it shows, is that the security forces in China are actually gearing up more towards dealing with internal problems than external ones. And the question of Taiwan is really interesting, because it's basically, in the Chinese mind, it is internal. So this whole thing that we see, where there's another Chinese government in Taiwan and on the island of Taiwan, and there's a mainland Chinese government, this isn't new. The same thing happened a couple hundred years ago, when basically during the war between the equivalent, the Ming and the Qing dynasties, the losing Ming dynasty fled to the island of Taiwan. This was the exact same thing we see today. And it was also, this was also a very commercial island. It was a lot of Southern Chinese. This is very different from the Northern Chinese. So when I was saying that China's not one place, there are provinces in China that are larger than any state in Western Europe except for Russia, right? They have more people. There are languages in China with more speakers that aren't Chinese, with more speakers than German or French in Europe. So these are places, and just the scale of these countries, right? These provinces have over 100 million people, right? Something like 180, 70 million people. These are countries in any other part of the world. And, without, if things don't go well in China, they become countries again, right? Maybe not functional countries, but they return to sort of their own, thing. And that is what the Chinese military and Chinese government is really focused on. It's keeping the pieces of China together. And that's where military investment is really going. There's a lot of, other things, and a lot of it's propaganda, and there is a lot of investment in other things, but the Taiwan thing matters because it is seen within China as a province of China. And that, if you don't get Taiwan, it encourages all the other provinces, which are, like I said, big, they have their own languages, they have this, they have that, it encourages them that maybe they can go their own way. If you have problems in Hong Kong, it encourages other large cities on the southern Chinese coast to also maybe start thinking about doing their own thing. And obviously, this seems a little weird to us, but in China, this is a big deal. If you have just a couple cities that become unmanageable, these are enormous cities. That's tens of millions of people. You're looking at huge problems. So China's always about nipping these problems in the bud early. And the existence of Taiwan is an affront to the Chinese Communist Party. It is another China that gained wealth independently, although Taiwan would not be as wealthy as it is if mainland China hadn't opened up. The whole Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China, it's actually originally it was a whole system in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. People don't talk about it, but the three were all coordinated in various ways. But Taiwan is an affront to the party still. It is a non-party ruled Chinese, country that is extremely prosperous, developed, advanced, and it did so without the protection and guidance of the party. And that is what the narrative is in China. Is it was the party that brought us to prosperity, and we're with the party to the end. You look at something like Taiwan, it says, well, they did pretty well without it. And these are where these questions come. The whole thing with, basically, punishing and bullying various companies and individuals and whatever to toe the line all across the world, toe the line on Taiwan. China's just trying to induce some fear and some greed in people to make them, support its vision of what, China and Taiwan need to be. They need to come together as one thing. But the real meat of the question isn't whether you can sort of convince random people in other countries to, change your mind. Is, can you convince the U.S. military, the U.S. government to give up on Taiwan? And can you convince Taiwan to actually join the fold? And after Hong Kong, after Taiwan saw what happens to Hong Kong in the last year or two, about this is what integration with China means. It means the loss of all your freedoms, the loss of media protections, the loss of democracy, the loss of all this. It's not happening. Everyone who knows anything in the Chinese government knows that there's no peaceful reunification with Taiwan. It's not on the cards anymore. So things are getting heated there for sure.
So doesn't China have a lot more to lose than to gain by pushing this, against Taiwan? Because if they lose, like you said, then it's going to look bad. It's going to look bad on them. Other cities, other provinces are going to go, hey, if Taiwan can break free of them, maybe we can as well. It seems to me like they have an awful lot to risk. And why don't they just leave it alone and instead of trying to push it? Hong Kong's a whole different story because, everybody accepts that Hong Kong belongs to China. I mean, in fact, China owns all the land, which I always found to be so strange that you can only rent the land from there. You don't actually own land when you live there.
Well, that's the same in China. You don't own any land in China. You rent it from the Communist Party, basically.
Right. So
that only started in the 90s.
Yeah, and this brings up another thing too. I look at it, and you look at the if you take like the four major provinces, and you go, they're so big as you had mentioned that at some point, just like with Russia, that it broke up into these smaller countries. It's like I almost think the only way that they'd be able to keep everything the way it is because they're under communist rule. I think we're going through that too. I mean, we have so many tribes now that to say 330 million people or whatever we're at right now, over 300 million people, that we're all going to think like, and we obviously don't. We have such a divide, and it's not just because, I mean, there's a lot of things that they're factored into why we have this big divide. But people in Texas don't think like people in New York. People in New York don't think like people in Wisconsin, and you have these different values, if you will, and these different ways of looking at life, and yet we're all going to try to be one big tribe, and it's just causing more and more conflict. At some point, do we not do like Europe? Do we not like, you have Germany, you have France, you don't have one big, country in Europe. You have several smaller countries which tend to get, I know back in the day
they tend to go to war is what they do, is they really do.
Yeah, but do they? But I mean, but this day and age, I think they've figured out it behooves us not to go to war with each other.
That's one of those things. That's, I think, mostly an illusion. It's the giant aegis of the U.S. military that allows all that to happen. Germany is a very weak, militarily vulnerable country. The original German state was, was Prussia, and it was basically, they used to joke that it was a army. And what was it? An army with a country or something like that. Like it was basically an army that happened to have a country, and it was true. I mean, and you see it right through the sort of very rigorous, disciplined, militarist operation of, any not militarist, but organization, right? It goes throughout the country. And it historically that manifests in, you got to have defensive wars, preemptive defensive wars, as ironic as that sounds, with all your neighbors. And I think just getting to the point about China being big, so big that it looks like it, crumbles. That's actually what happens. China, you go through all of Chinese history, you get brief periods where the state is one, it is together, it is unified, and you have much, much longer periods where it's broken into pieces and they're all fighting each other. That's what Chinese history is. And the Chinese Communist Party wants us all, and most textbooks will say, oh, look at this empire and this dynasty and this dynasty. It looks like one powerful dynasty after another powerful dynasty after another powerful dynasty. What it really is brief period where like 2 generations of a dynastic family kept things together, massive amount of chaos, a little bit of a little empire that came together, massive amount of chaos. That's what it actually looks like.
Right.
And China knows that. The government knows that. And so what it's trying to do is keep things together. You brought up a good point. Well, why don't they just not push the Taiwan thing if it could cause all these problems I was mentioning? So that's actually what they do. They push it in these ways that aren't real. So they push it with, verbal stuff and bullying various celebrities or companies and doing these sort of intimidation tactics in the Taiwanese airspace, but they don't actually try and do, an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, which is among the hardest military operations to conduct successfully. And basically all it would take would be mines and a lot of anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles, and it could never be done. It could never be done. Because you just think about it, right? You're trying to take over an island with tens of millions of people. You need endless ships just going back and forth, bringing fuel and more troops and more ships and more supplies and more everything, more. If you lose the ships, if you can't get across the strait, you're done. This is over, right? If your helicopters get blown out of the sky, and everybody knows this stuff. So that's what they're doing, is they're pushing as far. They want to intimidate everyone into just assuming that Taiwan is a fait accompli, that it's just going to happen. China is so big, it's so powerful. Taiwan is so small that no matter what happens, let's all just accept the inevitable and it'll get pulled together. That was their game plan. But it's obviously not going to work anymore. Everything's too antagonistic and it won't work. But to your point about, the U.S. now seeming to be so similar to China, that in the sense of us having all these fractures, and it seems like we don't get along. We're just like all these provinces. That's a big part of why I was doing what I was doing, is to see whether, how much truth there is to these sorts of questions. And the truth is, I think we're going through a period of extreme polarization and kind of a reconfiguring of the different political parties and political ideologies and political movements and political figures. It's all kind of up in the air right now. And we'll probably be in this for a while, but the actual integrity of the U.S. sort of nation is actually very strong, right? And a lot of what it comes down to, again, is what we were talking about earlier, the material sufficiency of North America. Can this place feed itself? Yes. Can it supply its own energy? Yes. Does it have its own consumer markets? Yes. Does it have can it reconfigure supply chains to be structured around it and to actually not be incredibly dependent on war-torn or violent or antagonistic countries within a few years? Yes. Most countries don't have that. And the reason China tends to break into, there's a lot of reasons, a lot of reasons China tends to break into pieces, but a big one is that you can't get everything everywhere. So a great example is energy. So right now, China uses like 50% more energy than the United States. It's huge, right? Like 1.25 million people. The 1.4 million is probably a lie. Just they kind of fudge those numbers. But you got over 1 billion people, and you have to you need power, right? It's obviously be more electricity, and you have so much industry in China to produce all these things. A lot of electricity you need, but 50% more energy than the United States use is a lot of energy. And the only natural resource China has to supply it is coal. And it uses over half of the world's coal, right? Everybody knows climate change, whatever anyone thinks about it. Coal's not exactly a pleasant thing to use. And there's a reason when I was in China, the sky in Beijing was like you could stare at the sun. It was so thick with fog. You have all these coal plants all around this northern plain in China. And it's grotesque at times what it does.
Can I stop you just for a second? So,
sure.
Because I want to ask about this. Didn't they just make a commitment like a couple of years ago to have all this solar power that they're just going to?
Yeah, it's bullshit, man.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, the truth is, it's like, so what they're trying to do is, originally, you go back 8 years, China thought there was, they were actively saying that climate change and global warming, it was all a plot by Western countries to stifle China's rise. They said the U.S. doesn't want us to use coal because they know it's the cheapest energy source we have, and they want us to use, windmills, whatever they were saying about it. Like, right, they want us to use all this stuff because they want us to crumble. What happened then is you had such a backlash in China over these environmental catastrophes all across the country that they kind of went on board with, renewable energy. They started to get export markets for solar, huge export markets for solar panels, and they kind of went along with it. But it just brings us back to that question: 50% more energy than the United States. How long does it take? How many solar panels do you need to to bring up that much capacity. And it's not just the installed capacity. There's you need all the transmission lines. You need special high voltage transmission lines. You need all these inverters. You need battery stations. And Chinese geography is very difficult. So the southern China, like Hong Kong area, it's surrounded, it's, back up against enormous mountains. And just to get infrastructure. So when I was down there, you could see, you have like giant mountains with electric towers, one on the other. It's insane. So trying to reconfigure this whole electric grid in China to serve everything, it's trillions of dollars. And China doesn't have that kind of money anymore. And the problem is they're getting a squeeze right now. You have the cheapest energy resource you have is coal, and you want to use as much as possible, but it's also the most maligned of all resources around the world. It has all these consequences. And then you also want to, be the big dog for environmental energy, be on the forefront of new technologies. But there's not really a conceivable world where China could run on electric cars and solar panels. Just geographically, the major places in China that have a lot of solar irradiation, where you could get a lot of solar energy, like Texas, the Mojave Desert, desert right next to LA. All of this is just, these are great regions for solar production. But in China, they're very far away from the major population centers. They're in Western China, in these sort of deserts around, over there. And just setting up huge power lines to send it into the main population centers, this is a huge project. It's also very variable. They're very, right now, there's power outages. There's been power outages in 2/3 of China. It is this exact problem we're talking about. You have the coal regions that got hit, and they're trying to limit coal slightly. Like you said, they want to end it they're going to start phasing out by 2026, they say, but you just can't sort of square this circle. You can't believe in the real thing China needs is basically nuclear energy. So I have an article on this for anyone who is interested. I wrote up a while ago. It's basically the best resource for China, if they really wanted to fix their energy problems, is almost certainly nuclear power. And they're investing in this, but the problem with nuclear power is that it's like billions of dollars per plant. If you do it wrong, if you try and mass produce it, you might end up with a Fukushima. You could lose all your public support, right? We've had this problem in the US since, since the 50s, but really since Third Mile Island in the 70s. So it's politically tough, even in a place like China. And the energy question in China, I mean, this is really one of the big ones. I'll kind of focusing on it because it's, like I was saying earlier, energy cascades through everything. So how in the body, you sometimes get you'll get an infection and it'll lead to some other thing. It'll cascade, give you whole proteins will start flowing and all these reactions will get catalyzed. It's something very similar in the economy happens with different inputs. So energy is an input that you use to do everything. Turn on your lights, to use the internet, to make steel, to produce plastics, to fuel cars, to every single thing. So the cost of energy starts rising. It starts to impact every single thing in the economy. So when I was saying earlier that, you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, that knowing in the 2000s that energy is important, this is kind of it. And, you get big energy prices in China, which is what we're seeing, really high energy prices. The whole idea of China being a cheap place to produce things, it starts to fade. You already have rising labor costs all across the Chinese coast, major sort of production centers. You have rising energy costs. You have rising political costs with all the antagonism between the US, China, and basically China and the rest of the world. This is what I was saying earlier, where companies are starting to have to really ask major questions about what they're doing in China and why. It really is one of those major things that's sort of affecting everything right now. And yeah, like they say all these things, but a lot of it's propaganda. They want the Chinese people to know that we're fighting these environmental issues. We're on the forefront of technologies. We're more advanced than the United States. We have more solar panels. We have this, we have that. But the actual ability to run, 1/3, China produced about 33% of all manufactured goods. They're assembled there, but the final product is about 1/3. You're not running all that infrastructure, all that equipment on, wind turbines and solar panels. I mean, just to do that into the industrial plant, so major factories, you'd have to retool every single individual factory to not run off of the fuel resources they use. It's just the scale of what would be required would be crazy. And if you want to run on electric cars, you better be prepared to have 4 to 5 times as much electricity. You need that much more because you have you have it stored in a fossil. I'm not supporting fossil fuels in any way. I'm just trying to say that the facts of how this works. It's like you have the energy stored in the fuel, so you don't have to get it from your power plant. If you want to take off all those cars, you have to do that too. So it's just it's basically an impossible sort of situation to deal using current technologies. It's kind of an impossible one to deal with. We're talking trillions of dollars to do all of this. And you have China has trillions of dollars and needs to invest in multiple different industries to kind of deal with the problems it has coming. And yeah, it's just a challenge. I mean, we're seeing more and more of China's talk get stronger, but the walk is becoming much slower, to say the least.
All right. So, what threats do China have against the U.S.? So, obviously, militarily, we're talking about boots on the ground, or you know, ships, planes, tanks, things of that nature. They don't compete against us. So, do they have something else that could be a threat? Like, um, can they use the fact that we owe them $1.1 trillion? What if they decide to, you know, cash in and say, hey, pay up?
Yeah,
What?
so
I mean, I know
that's a
I know it'll affect their economy as well, and as well as probably the world right now. But they might, I mean, could they use that and to help cripple us?
well, no, not really. I mean, the truth is that debt would get bought by any other country because it's a safe, reliable asset, right? So it's not really like we owe them. It's more they own U.S.
Well,
federal debt,
I would
right?
say that in most circumstances you're right, but with us continuing to just print money without any backing, the dollars at some point it's going to become, I don't want to say
Well, it's
worthless.
always relative. Remember, this is the thing. We always even I don't agree with all the money printing, but the question for currencies is always relative. It's the US dollar versus what else, right? And what else, let's leave aside cryptocurrencies for a second. What other major national currency is even playing the same game? This is why the government can print all this money. Because where they at, where are you gonna go? You're gonna get rupees, you
Do
get pesos,
you
you get
think
yen,
chance of
you
going
get
back to
euro.
gold?
What?
Do you think there's any chance of going back to the gold standard?
The goal having the sort of main power in the world tends to set up the global financial system, right? And the monetary system. And the British basically went in with the gold standard, but the US left the gold standard to kind of create the world we have, which is this dollar standard, basically. And you'd have to have a US government that was committed to a very different idea of money and leverage and political equality and fairness between countries to go back to the gold standard. And I just don't see any. There's a few things I see the U.S. government doing less than that. So I'd say that. I also say there's always a misconception, like why and how did China get all this debt, the U.S. debt, right? Obviously, we bought their products, but what also happens is that this is a quirk of industrial development. So, since the 1940s, you had something called export-oriented industrialization. It's actually a very good term, so I'll use export-oriented industrialization. We have countries that were kind of not prosperous, they weren't developed, and they basically exported goods to developed countries, right? So you had, this is Hong Kong, this was Japan originally, the major one in the 60s. Then you had Germany, you had South Korea, you had China, right? These are all major countries that export basically to the United States, the major consumer nation in the world. And what happens when you do that is that you gather up, like what would normally happen if you're selling all this stuff is your currency would appreciate because you're selling all this stuff, your country's doing well, you have all this money, but you can't have that because that would make your exports less competitive. So it really started with Japan, like in the 80s, the Reagan administration got all pissed off at Japan because they had all this, right? They were suppressing their currency. And Donald Trump was part of his brain was probably formed a bit during this era where tariffs and, punish them for keeping their currency low. That was a big theme back in the 80s, but it still applies because it's the same basic phenomenon. If you're selling all your stuff to this major country and you want to maintain your competitiveness, you have to hoard all of their currency to keep yours low. And that's what Japan's done forever. That's what China did as well. But that doesn't mean you're secure. So in the 2015, 2016, China burned through $1 trillion of its reserves to stabilize its currency during a major stock market disruption. So this is not it's trillion sounds really impressive until you have, bank runs, you have all sorts of problems cascading through your financial system. $1 trillion can disappear in a second. COVID's a great example. Oh, la-di-da, the government does nothing. And then they pass multi-trillion-dollar bills out of nowhere because when the financial problems hit, trillion starts to look like paper money. The same way the Fed prints it like paper money. This is what happens. So trillion isn't as impressive as it sounds, right? In a month, it could disappear. Not disappear, just get bought by other people. It won't be China's anymore.
So you think countries will still buy that debt up from China?
Oh yeah, I mean Japan. I mean all the other exporting countries would for sure do it, because they have the same problem, right? Right. So that's kind of how it would work. But I mean, another real question with this is sort of what is the value of those cryptocurrencies? I think that at this point, though, with the U.S. and China China totally cracking down and banning crypto in its country, and the U.S. Beginning the march to do the same, crypto had a good moment where it could say, oh, we're this innovation. You don't want to be missing out on the crypto innovation. But it's like, if the US doesn't allow the innovation and
Right.
China doesn't allow the innovation, no one's worried about missing out. What, you're going to go to Luxembourg? You're going to turn it into, no one's interested. So what we're going to see probably is a bizarre period of state-based monetary innovation using blockchain technology. So what I mean is China's already testing digital money, right? So they did a stimulus program where they basically gave some people money, and they said it was programmed into the money was basically you could use it for certain things within a certain period of time. So this is basically, constrained conditional money in all sorts of ways. And it's allowing the Chinese government loves this idea because it allows them to, control their population in more nuanced and granular fashion. And basically the rest of the world is responding to this because you have to, this is happening, right? It used to, oh, this is a theoretical problem. Crypto could be this, crypto could be that. But China's actually basically creating a central bank digital currency. So it banned crypto to allow the creation of a digital yuan, the equivalent of a digital Chinese dollar. And the Federal Reserve in the Treasury Department of the United States are looking at this and thinking, okay, well, if you're going to play this game, we have to really think hard about doing the exact same thing. And the irony is that China got on this path because it was terrified of the idea of a digital dollar, which, like we were saying, this is the central pillar in the global monetary system, financial system. That would be very threatening to China. To do anything like a digital dollar would allow the U.S. to do even more, get all up in its grill for all sorts of various little intermediary financial ways. And so we wanted to avoid that and do a digital yuan. But it's also pushing all the other countries to do the same thing. And what it's going to basically do is bring some of the innovations of crypto to central bank currencies. The ironic thing is that money is a very low tech, system. And even the truth is about a lot of blockchains, it's actually a very simple technology at the core of it. Not all the advanced stuff you could build on top of it. The actual core of it is actually very simple. So you can apply this stuff to, federal money, fiat currencies. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, China just kind of pushed the ball in this direction. And, we're going to see. I mean, it looks, you want me to just speculate really quickly about where this will go? I mean,
because I have a question in my mind, so you might answer.
Oh, go for it.
No, I was
okay. Yeah. Well, so we had the crypto phase, and it became a speculative asset primarily, and one used for some nefarious stuff that had a lot of optimism and stuff behind it as well. But now you're getting the clampdown, and you're going to see a period of sort of state innovation, and you're probably going to see sort of blockchain-based companies become more viable. 2023, 2026 timeframe, assuming they can keep capital and keep all that stuff running. But it's very weird in a way. Like what seems to have happened is that the crypto was became a $2 trillion asset class. That was enough to really galvanize action at the state level, because it was, like you said, they don't want to stop printing money. They're not going to do that. So they responded to this threat, which is bizarre. And you rarely ever see central banks respond to anything like this. So in this sort of way, so it's going to be interesting. So we're going to see that, and then we're going to have to see again how any sort of private crypto type businesses function. But I think the notion of a cryptocurrency will be kind of might seem like 2010's marketing in a weird way.
So if this state-based money comes about, is this money traced like so everything you buy, so
every single transaction in China will be traceable. Yeah, immediately traceable.
In the U.S., if they go this way as well, so
that's the real question. Yeah,
because the local guy that you go buy your weed from, you're not going to be able to purchase anymore because they're going to go, "What are you giving this guy $30 for?" or whatever. I don't know what weed costs, but
no, you're 100% right. What will probably happen is the U.S. will respond to China, but it's not going to do the exact same thing, because the U.S. priority isn't this population control and financial stability thing in the same way. although what government doesn't want more control over its people? So you never know, but there'll probably be more liberties assumed, and it probably won't be an attempt to totally destroy cash, which is kind of what China's up to as well. But you're very right. This is definitely something to keep an eye on. I mean, you got to be looking when Federal Reserve reports and Treasury reports about their plans for this sort of thing come out. People should be very aware of what does this imply about what they're actually trying to do. Are they trying to quote unquote compete with China? Are they trying to quote unquote prevent fraud, or what are they really trying to do? And it'll kind of tell you in what the system is meant for. But there's some good things about this, and there's some bad things, but it definitely looks like they're coming. It's also going to affect the banking sector, right? It's going to affect a lot of parts of this country, and it's it's interesting. I mean, the good thing about it is that innovation doesn't usually happen this rapidly, and it's bizarre to kind of see it happening at this kind of monetary level in a lot of ways. But I don't want to speculate too much, but I like to be optimistic about this stuff, just because the crypto craze got a little crazy, right. And it's the problem with crypto is that you had like good ideas surrounded by insane hucksters and grifters, just like spiraling like a vortex. And the problem is a lot of the noble people in the center, they probably got a little bit too much money, a little bit too much attention, and they kind of spiraled out into the huckster grifter thing. Maybe just in and out. It's so interwoven, right, that I mean, we've all seen that.
I'll speculate a little. I see that if this happens, I think you'll find that people will start hoarding gold, because if everything's going to be traceable, it's like the government will know exactly how much money you have. And a lot of people don't put their money in banks. I mean, a lot more than you might imagine. They have safes at home or whatever, where they have a good chunk of money, and they don't want anyone to know how much they have. People who buy gold tend to do that for that same reason as well. And so now it's going to be that the government knows exactly how rich or how poor you are. and with that comes a lot of power, a lot of control, with knowing what someone's lifestyle really is and not what you think it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the way the tax system is set up is to give a certain picture of your wealth and your income and everything. And are we moving to a place of more, intrusive awareness on the government side of what it actually looks like? I mean, probably, but this is kind of a hard thing to fight when it really is just numbers in a database. You know what I mean? You get down to it, it's all numbers in a database. So you can do, and even all you need, you could even put you could have your gold on a scale in your bathroom. You could set it up and have it feed into an Excel spreadsheet cell, and boom, that's another number in the thing. It could tell you exactly how much your gold is worth, right, moment to moment. I think we have a weird. I think the 2010s kind of misled us a little bit and made us focus too much on the monetary stuff, on the money. And what we really need to look at more is the real economy. It's businesses, it's actual productive capacity, it's consumer decisions and choices and purchases, because money really is just numbers in a database at this point. And the focus on all the currency stuff, there's obviously a lot of problems with fiat and stuff, but we need to focus more on the real economy, right? I think that's one of the lessons if you want to look at what happened in the 90s, 2000s, and kind of why there was such a blowback against China policies, is just this sense that the actual real economy was destroyed at the price of fatter corporate profits and a bit more consumer ease and margins. So it's a tough one, but the real, I mean, you always got to remember the value of the US dollar, it's related to the full productive and consumptive potential of the country, right? You get back down to it. The real value of any of these currencies, ideally not crypto, obviously, but the real value is rooted in an actual economy, right? It's like part of an economy. It's not like some weird abstraction that kind of can float in and out and be whatever it wants to be in a different moment. And I just think that's where we got to put our brain power back to, what are the businesses we need? What are the services, the goods, the technologies, because I mean, I look around at what happened during the pandemic, and it's just, there's been a lot of people got really badly hit, real badly hurt, don't know what they need, don't know what they want, don't know where they are. And there's a lot that can be done, for us to be useful and produce things that are really, really valuable to people. I I look at all this, especially you look at China, with just like I was saying, it's like they invested here, they did everything they need to do, and then they're like, let's just keep doing it. Let's just keep pushing. We don't need to develop all this and build all this shit, but we do. We don't want to do the same thing in the financial world, which has been what the U.S. does. Actually, we overinvest in all this financial stuff, and then we have these brutal corrections. And the truth is that that you're always paying it on credit, right? You're saying it's gonna be way better. Oh, this is gonna be so much worth so much 5 years from now, 3 years from now. If you want to make that bet, it's always good to bet it on something, do real goods and real services.
Right. I mean, I know that I don't understand the mindset of continuing to build something because you can. And like I understand, like in China, they're in the four provinces that they have unoccupied housing that could house 200 million people that's just unoccupied, because during that the period of where they were just building, they just continued because they could. And now I go, wow. I go, you have something that's unoccupied that could house 200 million people, and you don't. It's unoccupied. It just seems like a waste.
Oh, it's even worse than that. It's deceit. It's lies and deception. I mean, remember I was saying that China says it has 1.4 billion people. Well, let's just do some basic math here. It's like you've had a one-child policy since the 70s. So how is that adding up? How is it adding up to a larger and larger population year after year? Seems a little dubious that at some point that might not have stopped because you're not allowed to have the babies. Anyway, they've done research, and China probably has about 1.25-ish million people. But that means that the whole economy was basing its numbers on something that was flawed. So, okay, you have 200 million people. I mean, that's, if you thought you had 1.4 billion people, that looked like it was on the mark. So China was already overproducing. Like, actually, I hadn't heard the 200 million figure. That doesn't sound insane to me, but the property sector in China is so overbuilt. There's nothing like it in human history. Nothing. Like, people don't quite get it. You go to China, let's say you're taking a train, like anywhere in China, from one random city to another random city, you'll often see along the side of the tracks, it's not even a city. This isn't even like a city. You'll just see forests of apartment towers, just forests of them alongside tracks. And you're just thinking, they all look the same. It's very creepy and very Stalinist. You're just like, who the hell lives here? Who the hell lives here? It's almost like they were just, okay, let's just build along the way to get to our site. But it's so overbuilt, and it has to do with the role of property in the Chinese economy. It's basically the only hard asset people have. Everything you get, the government basically gets its money through that and through some local government stuff, and it's so embedded in everything that it's become the golden goose. So they never wanted property prices to fall, but they were producing all of these homes. It's a total disaster in the making. So you might have heard about this Evergrande situation in China. It's basically this property company that's getting squeezed right now. And I did a surprise hour-long live stream on this. People can find. But this is it's about Evergrande, but it's not really about Evergrande. This is about the fundamental just integrity of the Chinese property market. Right? It's so screwed. It's so messed up from top to bottom. And the Chinese government's avoided dealing with it for like 10 years because they're too scared of what was going to happen. Not trying to criticize. It actually is very scary what could happen. So, and no one knows how it could shake out. But they've just allowed this problem to get worse and worse and worse. So it's it's a ticking time bomb for sure. So what happened with the Evergrande things for a while? You had thousands and thousands of projects across the country that shut down. You had like the property market almost froze, and you just remember like how in the US there's real estate, there's subprime, like a lot of banking runs on collateral, right? They always want to know, here, we'll give you a loan, but what collateral do you have against it? Well, the best collateral has always been land. Land doesn't go away, doesn't rust, doesn't do anything. It's always integral to the financial system in any country. And it's the same in China, and it's very perverse, a lot of the ways these things have structured themselves. But it's a total disaster. And this is one of the things we were talking about, all the things that could kind of knock China to pieces. This property system, the energy problem that I mentioned, the demographic problem. I haven't really touched on it, but it's just the Chinese population is not only smaller, but it's older, it's aging. There's a massive sex ratio imbalance. There's enormous problems.
Yeah, that was
And
have you talk on that just for a second because I don't think people understand that because of the one child thing that you just brought up. I was going to ask you, my understanding that China is going to be the first country that gets old before it gets rich, and that meaning that
yeah,
the population is getting older and there's not as many people working to take care of the older generations, and so there's going to be this another issue that they have, with
yeah,
along with a million others.
yeah, along with a million others. It's right. I think it was 2007, 2008, where I think it was World Bank economists. They started talking about something called the middle income trap. Basically, countries develop, and they don't make it into high income. Very few countries have ever, in this sort of development era of the last 75 years, very, very few countries have ever made it into um, yeah, the actual advanced, high income, sustainably high income sort of nation. It just is incredibly rare. Almost everyone just stalls out in the middle. And China has a massive, they've known for 12, 15 years this is going to be a problem. China's problem is just it's so big. It's so big. If you're Japan, if you're other kinds of countries, you can, your per capita income can rise. China's per capita income is not anywhere where it needs to be just because there's too many people. And there's bad numbers. I mean, the education, we always assume China's, it's educating so many engineers and so many of this and so many of that. It's bad. The number of, I think it's 2/3 of China doesn't even have the Chinese people over 25 don't even have a full high school education.
Wow.
So it's just, again, it's a scale question, right? This is the fundamental thing. One important thing anyone to take away from this is just the challenge with any country is often scale. How does X scale up? How does this scale up? How does your energy system scale up? How does your housing system scale up when you need to get to something like a China size country? Most things don't scale well. And so another one, obviously education. It's like, well, of course, if China was basically dirt poor in the 90s and early 2000s, of course, it didn't educate everyone in beautiful schools with great technology. They barely got anything. They just kind of did what they could. And we kind of forget that because it looks so gleaming and amazing and beautiful now. But they didn't have the resources for a lot of things. And like you were saying, they're aging. And it's like if you're trying to get a wife at 55 or something for the first time, you never thought about it before. It's like, well, man, maybe you missed the boat there, right? There's a phase for this, and the whole country, like right now in the U.S., the millennial generation is hitting about 32, which is when when people move out to the suburbs and they start moving and buying homes, and that's one of the reasons the property market all across the country is so crazy. It's like, yeah, millennials are buying homes. It's the largest generation in U.S. history, so that's happening everywhere since prices are rising. There's a similar thing with all sorts of factors. The demographic factors are very important when you're sort of looking at countries, and for China, the demographics are very bad, right? The educational ones are very bad. Healthcare ones can be very bad. The ability to care for elderly people is very bad. And even more ominously is the connection between demographics and consumption, right? So basically, you're age 0 to 18. It's weird to say age 0, but from birth to 18, you're just a cost, right? You're being educated, you're being fed, you're being housed, you can't work, there's no child labor, there's education. It's just everyone's paying for you for everything. And then you're still getting educated. It's not really till you're like 30s, 40s, 50s, you start really earning money, paying taxes, really putting things back into the system. And those are the people that also have kids and that purchase new things. So those are the people that really consume all the stuff. Well, China's problem is that it's going to have a lot of people that just, it's not going to be able to support the consumer economy it needs because it doesn't have the right demographics to do it. It's just going to end up with all these costs, with all these elderly people, and the people who you need to consume and to pay for everything, there's just not going to be enough of them. And that means that this transition, what China's needed to do for over, let's say 12, 13 years, probably, let's just say since 2009, when the financial crisis hit, has been to start moving to a consumer economy, right? We in the US, we criticize the consumer economy a lot because it's like, why don't we make anything anymore? Why are we just consuming, right? So there's a good point. There's a real point to that. But consumption is how you decide what to make based on what people will consume, right? And obviously, you sometimes just go for it. You think, hey, hope they like it, and you knock it out of the park like the iPhone or whatever. But you needed feedback from the consumer economy to kind of get things done, to see what the desires are. And in China, if you don't transition to a consumer economy, there's no way for this show to stay, to keep the lights on. Basically, you can't export anymore. You export more than anyone's ever exported. You can't invest anymore. You can't build more infrastructure. You built more than anyone ever built. You can't, the only thing to do is to transition to a consumer economy and to start looking more like the United States. It doesn't mean you can't have all the production, right? The US decide, hey, we'll export the production all around the world and just, you know what I mean? We lost the production that was in Ohio and the Ohio River Valley and all the Rust Belt areas. And we said, oh, we'll put it there, we'll allow it to move around the world to appease this whole global system we have. China can't do that. It needs to have the whole production, needs to have the export, needs to have the investment, and needs to have the consumption to keep everything together. And it's just trying to get that. It's just almost impossible.
Well, under the CCP, I would think it would be impossible. I mean, that's the thing. It's like it seems to me, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but they've been so focused, as you said earlier, on the internal conflicts and stuff, and keeping this all together, to where they have more cameras than we have people in the US, and then they have that what's that rating of their social status. Like they're so,
social credit score.
yeah, they're so about controlling their people that they've hindered their own growth. They have such a fragile um internal, system, that they can't even afford to take a chance on something like Taiwan. They might be, like you said, they might talk to talk, but they're not going to walk to walk, because if Taiwan breaks free, then all of a sudden that there could be a domino effect throughout China, that other provinces or even cities consider rising up against the system. And so it seems like they've kind of, from controlling how many kids you could have and everything, that they shot themselves in the foot, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to a really deep point about just why countries are the way they are. So I think the best way to think about it is, China didn't really have a choice in this whole matter. Like, let's say China wasn't communist. Let's say that people in Taiwan had won, right? Currently in Taiwan, they had won. It was a nationalist government. China wouldn't end up communist, probably maybe not as heinous and terrifying in a lot of ways, but would have ended up a large authoritarian, quasi-totalitarian state, because that's what China's always been. The reason China ends up the way it is just because of what's necessary to keep China together, to keep it an ordered state, versus just have it descend into total chaos, total violent chaos. So, before the 20th century, the two deadliest wars in human history were both Chinese civil wars. And the two deadliest natural disasters, besides famines, besides epidemics, actually including famines, which both Chinese, basically floods in China and a famine in China. Like when I was saying that things scale poorly in China, one thing that scales, and depending on your perspective, very well or very poorly, is mass chaos and violence. Very few places on earth has seen as much bloodshed as northern China in particular. There's very few places on earth that have even come close. And the Chinese government knows that. So the second they manage to pull all the pieces together, they manage to, the warlord chaos period ends, they grab all the pieces, they hold on for dear life. And the only way to do that, manage the population, prevent, basically what they're worried about is a modern version of a peasant rebellion. That's basically what it is. And it sounds funny, but there have been so many, it would blow your brain to know how many peasant rebellions there have been in China. It's like hundreds, maybe thousands and thousands. It was almost like a yearly event. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It's the poverty in China. There's a whole host of things that come together to make China so politically unstable. But you're definitely right that what this means is trying to create a consumer economy, trying to have the most innovative tech companies and compete globally around the world. No. China's got bigger problems.
Is it just because of scale? Because Japan was very similar in having a totalitarian type, system, and yet they were able to switch over, obviously. But again, they're much smaller, and so do you think it's just because of the scale?
Well, there's a couple of things. So Japan is actually a really interesting case, and basically Japan was very similar to China for hundreds of years. It was only in the last 500 years that it really started to change, and a key factor for Japan is that it's a smaller and more culturally and ethnically homogenous country. So you have all these islands, but they're connected by sort of multiple inland seas and stuff like that. And when the last 300 years that it really came together during the sort of closed off from the world phase, and then in the 19th century, they sort of opened up to the world and managed to integrate a lot of Western technologies and everything together. This is the best example anywhere on earth of a country, transforming itself into the modern world as a sort of integrated, powerful, successful nation. And to say that China has looked at Japan enviously would be an understatement, because that isn't really possible in China. And there's a lot of reasons. It's not just scale. You're right. I mean, I don't want to, there's a lot of things to get to, but I mean, the demography of China, the actual different ethnic groups, different various peoples, various histories is very bad. The geography of China makes physically integrating these different regions extremely difficult. It wasn't even possible until the last 50 years. The history and a couple of things. There's just the ability. So different countries around the world come together in more or less successful ways, right? So a place like, say, Egypt, for example, has been around for a very long time. It's basically just a strip of food, industry, agriculture, housing along the Nile, and then along huge deserts, thin Nile Delta. That's all there is, right? That's it. It's not very hard to control this place. It's all one people. Obviously, people come invade you or whatever, but very easy to get that together into one piece. Very different if you're a country like Russia, which is giant, vast expanse that crumble. That could just, like China, could new little stands could pop out of Russia, right? You could have a Tatar stand pop out of Russia. Again, just like the Soviet Union broke down, suddenly Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, that's kind of the similar thing that with these sorts of countries. And, it's multiple factors. It's typically a combination of culture, language, economic resources, and sort of internal geography, internal divisions within the country, right? So Europe can't be a United States of Europe because there's too many physical divisions. There's linguistic divisions, cultural now, and then over time you get ethnic and then national divisions. China's big fight. They don't want any national divisions. They've been very successful at preventing actual full nations, except for Taiwan, kind of to come about. But the scale of these divisions in China is like Europe, right? It doesn't look that way, but they're just as messed up in a lot of ways. The U.S. is a really good example. Like, part of the reason the U.S. can have such a messy, divisive politics and such a kind of freewheeling economy is actually because the actual foundation of the country is more stable than most other ones. Since the Civil War, every other war, the U.S. more people died, more Americans died in the Civil War than every other war put together. And there's been no major threat to the United States in over 150 years. And so the people are very, very, the country is very, very secure, very solid. And, that allows for a lot of chaos within the country, whether that's economic, that could mean economic dynamism or total booms and busts. That can mean all sorts of cultural advances, all sorts of new art styles and music styles and all that. It could be, it comes out in all these different ways, all these sort of transforming political parties, new political ideologies, all of the party labels stay the same. It's allowed when you have the security. China is, like you said, far too fragile to allow this. What we saw since 1978, 1979 is really one of the brief periods where China basically opens up the ports. It opens up the country to foreign goods, foreign people, foreign ideas, foreign money, foreign technologies, foreign science, and it tries to integrate it as much as possible, throughout the state. And then when all the energies that it's allowed into the country become too much, it battens down the hatches. That's what happens. Right. And so we're seeing that in all the tech CEOs, the equivalents of the Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, they're all being told to kowtow to the government right now, because they know you can't have this anymore. Like, you can't, in a world, and celebrity, gossip, all these things, video games, everything, they're cracking down on every single thing, because you cannot have sources of celebrity, authority, status, power that are outside the party, that are outside the primary hierarchical political system the country is built around. It is just too threatening. And it seems ridiculous to us, but of course, Donald Trump became president. Right. Kanye West wants to become president, that kind of thing. There is a route into politics, there is a route into power through the charisma and the attention people can garner. Even that is too much for the party, right? So that's fragile, right? Nobody's worried about this kind of stuff if you feel secure. Do you know what I mean? You don't start regulating every little thing in every little minor area of life.
Well, I think you made a great point, which I think most Americans don't realize, is that China isn't a homogeneous society like we tend to think. I'm sure if you ask the average American, it's like, the people that China is made up, they're all going to say Chinese, and they're all going to have this one image of what a Chinese person looks like. They're not going to understand that there's different sects, different religions, different languages, all within what we consider China to be, and so we don't look at it as a heterogeneous society, which does make things a lot more difficult. Which, you know, I think lends itself to say the things that we've done, being a heterogeneous society ourselves, and the accomplishments we've done, it's somewhat miraculous. I think it's because it's so much harder to do things when you don't have, like Japan, where it was, homogeneous for the most part, where everybody's on the same page, if you will.
Yeah. The thing about the US that's really rare is that we're sort of a immigrant society, right?
Right.
So Japan is Japan, and it's filled with Japanese people. The U.S. was uh, quote unquote American, which meant something, but it kept allowing new people in to change what it meant to be American over time, and that is extremely rare. It's a sort of flexible national identity. Obviously, it eventually kind of solidifies to some degree, but that's super rare, and that is, one of the reasons I think that you get, like you said, you can have a heterogeneous sort of population, yet a strong national identity, and you're able to get a lot more stuff done. I think there is a question about shared sacrifice, right? That's the thing. Japan, one of the reasons it can stay, it's had 3 lost decades or something now since the 90s, and it's still there. It's still kicking. It's still the third largest economy in the world. There's a much lower threshold for shared sacrifice. They're willing to do it. China is very different. China's very materialist, very hustle, very go-getter, very, so that's made a lot of energy, a lot of production and stuff recently. But what about the period when we all need to pull in together, and we all need to deal with the cascade of crises coming our way? That is when the rubber really hits the road, right? All right, are we really one big happy Chinese family? Have we ever been one really big happy Chinese family? That's the question. And you're really right. I mean, the primary division in Chinese history within China was basically northern and southern China, which, like, you go talk to Chinese people, they'll tell you if someone's from northern or southern China. It's visible to them, and that, that's only just the start. There's all these little regions. I remember when I first went to Shanghai, I was startled by how, I thought I was listening to Chinese, and I heard this language that sounded like French to me. They have a Shanghainese, which is a very lilting, almost musical form of, so in China they call languages dialects, because they're, like you said, with Taiwan, China is always trying to pretend like China is one big country, one people, one country, one ethnic group, one political system. They want one unitary state. It's just not, right. But the reason we all think that is because it's been very successful at marketing it that way, and it focuses on it so much because it knows the dangers of allowing, like we said, with Taiwan, with Hong Kong, anything heterogeneous, anything you acknowledge all of this, it's very dark. And actually, in Chinese history, there are whole civilizations in China. The core Chinese people was known as Yellow River civilization. For various reasons, that is the right way to think of early Chinese history, formed around the Yellow River. But just over the mountains, there was a whole other group of people in Ba Shu. They were there for 1,000, 2,000 years. Totally different culture, totally different stuff. And that's the region it's in, which is called Sichuan, which is where the food comes from, right? The SZE, that kind of Chinese food. It's a dialect. It's a province of China. That is a place they really don't want to start getting ideas of independence. That's just the way to put it. So it's a dicey thing, and this is the reason you can't trust what you hear about China, because it's too big and there's too much propaganda and there's too many biases and there's too many systematic attempts to make you see certain things that maybe aren't the truth. And it's actually very good. It's very good training for not believing things when you have to wade through propaganda about all this stuff.
Friends, that was the end of part 1. Be sure to check out part 2 in 2 weeks when we return from a very brief hiatus. Until that time, be sure to take care, be safe, wear your mask, and we'll see you then. Peace.